Hello and welcome to the last episode of Politics Today in 2023, and in this programme we'll be looking back at the major political stories that happened throughout the year. On foreign policy, we saw that the Russian war in Ukraine continued to dominate issues, as well as looking at the devastating impact that Hamas terrorist attack had on Israel and the rise of Jew hatred around the world. And also the other aspect of foreign policy that affected Britain was the Windsor Agreement, and that was an agreement signed by Britain and the EU in terms of our relationship with the European Union. On the domestic front, was very much dominated by 7 by-elections, mass illegal immigration to the UK, local council elections, the COVID-19 inquiry, and the return of David Cameron to frontline politics as our Foreign Secretary, and of course the coronation of King Charles III. So that was a roundup of 2023. So I've got 2 very special guests joining me today, Pastor Chris Wickland, and together with Dr. Sarah Tongue from Prayer for Parliament. Sarah, just give us your thoughts and reflection on 2023 and the political events that unfolded during the course of the year.
Well, in terms of Prayer for Parliament, I think the number one thing we were praying for consistently was expose the truth, expose. And if you look at things now, what is absolutely incredible is the number of things that have cropped up. We've seen through the veil, right? And some of the things haven't been very pretty or haven't been very nice, but it's good to see that we prayed these things. But the most shocking thing is, even though the truth is revealed, people aren't interested. They don't want to know, particularly the most recent and ongoing Israel-Hamas. They don't, in large measures, they don't want to know the truth. They would rather protest against something they don't know anything about. They attest they don't know anything about, often when they're interviewed, but it feels good to protest for the benefit of the Palestinians, but not knowing the details, not knowing Israel's history, not knowing the land history, just not wanting to know.
And come out in support of a genocidal terrorist organisation.
Yeah, and how things get flipped.
Yeah, very much so. And Chris, it's great to have you on the programme as we reflect on the big political news stories of 2023. What are your thoughts on this political year that we've just been through?
Well, I'd call it a white knuckle ride of a political ride this year, because we've seen a lot of things happen, and I think we're seeing a House of Parliament that's becoming fractured and stressed. It's one constant thing after another, and there's only so much firefighting you can do. I mean, good politics is you get ahead of the curve, but I feel politically we're always behind the curve because we're constantly firefighting the next thing. So I think politics has gone through a big strain this year. And I also think as a nation we've gone through a big strain as well, because things are changing so quickly that I don't think the average person on the street can keep up with the societal changes that are going on around us. And so I think, 2024, it's almost like you're just going to wake up with a dizzy, blurry head as to what's going to happen this year. And I kind of think that's what it's been for 2023. It's just been one thing after another. And I think politically, I don't think politicians have been able to keep up with the speed of it, and I don't think the general public have been able to keep up with it either.
Yeah, I mean, economists say that once in a generation you'll have what is known as an economic earthquake that jolts the markets, has a profound impact on nations and societies. But over the last 3 years, we've had several. Yeah. The COVID-19 pandemic, followed by the lockdown, then followed by the Russian invasion in the Ukraine, and now we've got another one with October the 7th. So this is what I think governments struggle to deal with, as you mentioned, when we have these huge geostrategic fault lines that open up, which causes huge problems, and it's how you respond to those challenges and political circumstances.
A prime example is with the education situation. Kemi Badenoch finally coming out and saying schools do not have to support transgender in simple, to synthesize it all. We've been talking about this since January, and it's December, and it's like they've only just woken, no pun intended, but it's almost like the government has only just woken up to it. And yet it's been in the news, and it's been on online news, and the issues and the concerns that parents have all through the year. So it's like a time lag, and they're behind the public.
Absolutely. And so what are your thoughts? Because back in February, we had the Ukrainian President Zelensky, visit the UK. There he met our Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak. He also then addressed the members of Parliament in Westminster Hall for both houses, both the Parliament and the House of Lords, but he also had an audience with King Charles III as well. Just show us your thoughts on this historic visit by President Zelensky.
In a nutshell, I was absolutely horrified in the sense that I'm not prophetically saying who Zelensky might represent, but we can see by his being allowed into our Parliament via camera, but also in the Westminster Hall, not actually in the Parliament. But while he was speaking on camera and his image was projected in the Parliament and everybody listening, and he did this in various nations around Europe, I was horrified because I thought this is the sort of thing that is going to happen if you can, or could happen if you consider, you know, the false savior, right? So that's what I thought of, not labeling him as it, but that's how some entity gets into individual governments.
Absolutely.
Quite horrific.
Very much so. And Chris, what are your thoughts on the continuing British unwavering support for the Ukraine and its war to expel Russia from its territory?
To be honest with you, the whole Russian-Ukrainian war has been something that's always just left me with lots of question marks, because there's lots of conflicting information out there and I'm not really hearing it from any one particular source directly. So I've got everything from Vladimir Putin wants to, you know, be the next kind of like Russian Tsar and bring back Russian orthodoxy back to the Ukrainians, and you hear that kind of story and that's in like major press and you think that can't be credible. And then you've got the other side where the Ukrainians are running child trafficking rings, and that's why Russia is coming against them. And I'm a bit perplexed as to, well, what is the truth here? And if there is something that's quite sinister going on, then we have, as a nation, we're supplying weaponry to a country that's, you know, firing these at another country. And we also need to understand that just because we're supplying weapons we can get around it. We think, well, if I supply weapons to them, that's not really me pulling the trigger. Well, actually, no, if you're arming another country to fight against another country, it is potentially a problem that could cause us to be drawing us into a bigger war if this continues on.
I think to answer your question there, because this is NATO and because Russia threatens the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and the military alliance that was set up to counter the Soviet threat during the Cold War, means that if, for example, we have a domino effect, if Putin then conquers and takes the whole of Ukraine, then the Baltic states are next, and it's part of restoring his empire. So if we then become defenseless and don't push back that Russian threat, then our own national security of Europe becomes a threat. And the other aspect of this one was also the globalist agenda to use this war in order to bring down Putin. So the longer this war continues, the more money, I think it's almost like 40% of Russia's GDP is spent on this war, which could lead to political and economic collapse in Russia and regime change. So that's, I think, the game that the United States, the Biden administration is playing on that one. And Sarah, looking at the biggest political story of the year that really has affected Christians, and I think we have to look north of the border in Scotland with the resignation of First Minister Nicola Sturgeon and the election who would become the leader of the Scottish Nationalist Party and also who would become the next First Minister. And we had Kate Forbes, who was a Bible-believing Christian, standing on biblical values, but also her track political record. I mean, she wrote the entire budget for Scotland in a day. So, I mean, she's very capable politically, but we see because of her Bible-believing beliefs, she was heavily attacked by the media and actually then went on an assault against her so she wouldn't become First Minister. And
absolutely raked over the coals. You know, Tim Farron, that happened with the Liberal Democrats some years ago. It's incredible, and yet the same questions weren't posed to Hamza Youssef, who, as a Muslim, would have many of the same sentiments in terms of the gay rights and all that stuff, education and the knock-on effects of that. So yeah, absolutely, rooting for Kate Forbes. Although what I found was difficult was, well, if she wins, does that mean Scotland's going to be more empowered to separate? So personally, I felt challenged in how to support her in prayer. But real courage, real capability, and somehow, in some respect, perhaps she'll be used in using her capabilities in some other way politically, because she's very outstanding.
And Kate Forbes as well had a very clever strategy. She learnt from the failures of Tim Farron when asked of his position on the whole issue towards gay marriage, and he was very forthcoming with his views until he was hounded out of office or the position of the leader of the Liberal Democrats. But she came out straight and said, these are my Christian values, these are what I believe, I'm not hiding anything. So I thought the strategy was good. But what does it say going forward? That does that mean now that a Bible-believing Christian cannot enter politics and not get to the very top because of our own values are discriminated against? So,
I mean, one of the things that kind of makes me a bit cross about all of this is that most people know, especially a good historian, that English culture and Western culture comes from Christianity. And so to actually have people in politics saying no to Christians is completely opposite. You have the Houses of Parliament that's got scripture written in the walls of it, for goodness sake. It's what it's based on. Our laws are based on Judeo-Christian laws. And so to have this constant aberration against Christians, I just think it's terrible. I mean, Kate Forbes, she was smart, she was intelligent, she was a good politician, she was a good Christian, she understood the difference between church and state, and she played that really well. Not many politicians can do that. And as you say, now we've got Yousaf Hatton, yeah. And so he's now in authority. But we've got a politician who's politically compromised because he's now putting the interest of his religion and his people group in Gaza before the people of his own country, of the nation of Scotland. And no one seems to be questioning it. No one seems to be saying anything. And from what I heard at the time, on the ground, it was that Kate Forbes was the popular vote for the public, but when it came to the political class, they didn't want her. And I just think it's a sign of the times. But, we have to also remember it was people like Wilberforce and various other people that were involved in politics that really shaped this nation into what it is. And I think we've got to be careful that we're not undermining our own history and our own identity as a nation politically. And,
Absolutely. And so the other big topic really was the Windsor Agreement. And we know that the issue of Brexit, ever since we had that referendum back in 2016, has dominated British politics until COVID came along and shifted it off the political agenda. But, we had an agreement with the European Union known as the Windsor Framework. But of course, you have to read the small print that Rishi Sunak was getting praise for an historic agreement with the EU, and this is great for trade, this is great for our relationship with the EU. But the small print was effectively surrendering Northern Ireland to the EU.
They got rid of the protocol, which was the one thing that was protecting this nation and the four nations against Europe, and they got rid of it. So it's tragic, really, and not much else to say about that. The DUP are still fighting for Northern Ireland as a separate entity from Ireland and as part of the UK, but it's the Windsor Agreement is not, I agree with you, is not what it was sold to be at all. And the costs and the difficulties that Northern Ireland still face because of this invisible border in the Irish Sea continue.
And Chris, also we've got to remember with Northern Ireland is essentially not only one of the last bastions of our Judeo-Christian heritage in Britain, but also in Europe, if not the world, with so many strong Christians there, so many churches in Northern Ireland. So for the UK government of Rishi Sunak to surrender Northern Ireland to the EU, that's sending a dangerous message out regarding our sovereignty and was Brexit everything that is promised to be, because it seems that we're still tied into the European Court of Human Rights, where they can actually then overturn, for example, the government's legislation on Rwanda. They intervened on the Rwanda plan to bring illegal migrants and process their asylum application in Rwanda, said that was illegal.
Yeah, so I remember the pledge for Brexit was control of our borders and sovereignty. And both of those things have not been dealt with. In fact, immigration is now even worse than it's ever been. I think the reports for last year's 1.2 million people came into this country. It was projected at 600,000, but now it's 1.2 million. There are going to be another 1.2 million this year, another 1.2 million next year. Also, there's been more migration into this country in the last 25 years than in all of the history of Great Britain. This is absolutely ludicrous. And the fact that we're still signed up to the EU with the European Court of Human Rights, it's just actually, I don't think the problem is so much with the politicians. I think we've got another problem here, which is Whitehall. Whitehall seems to be, well, this is what we believe, this is what we want, so whatever the politicians want, if that's not where we're going, well, we're not going to do what the politicians say. So we've got unelected people in power that are doing what they want to do, which is a complete juxtaposition and different odds to what the politicians want and what the people of this nation want. So I think actually the nation has been scammed on the whole Brexit thing. I don't really think what was given to us at Brexit and what we were told and sold it for has happened at all.
Absolutely. And moving on, one of the other big issues, as we mentioned just a minute ago, was the problem of mass illegal immigration into the UK. And, Suella Braverman, who was our Home Secretary until she was fired recently, was incredibly impressive. She understood it. She understood that mass illegal immigration posed an existential threat. She was very strong on Israel. She was very strong on defending the Jewish community here. And yet she's gone, and she's the one that was so forthright in her views to get something done. Just share with us how, whatever risk she puts in that position, it's James Cleverly at the moment, but they need to wake up to this danger and really do something if they stand any chance of winning the general election next year.
What I honestly believe, and this comes out of prayer and prayer with a group and things, Suella Braverman is the braver man.
Amen.
She's the one that's straightforward. The media twists what she says, and in her exhaustion and in cutaway, she says something in context, they take it out of context. All sorts of quotes and misquotes. And so the media didn't like her. But as with so much else that's going on with government, the people, the vast majority of people, are rooting for individuals and policies the government's more or less ignoring, the media hates, and Whitehall ignores. Yeah. So what the people want is not what's happening. And I think when you boil it right down, we pray for to be a sheep nation. And I think a lot of people, whether they believe God or not, whether they understand Christianity or not, they have those foundations, those principles, and so they want what's right. And by God's grace, I pray that, we need revival, we need all sorts of things, but that this may be a sheep nation. And right now, it is not going in that direction at all.
Yeah. And Chris, what are your thoughts on the government's constant attempt to get illegal immigrants flown over to Rwanda, where Rwanda will press their process application to the UK, but also mainly as a deterrent, really? Looking at the model in Australia, which has been very, very effective in stopping mass illegal immigration. But this poses an existential threat, not only to the identity of our country, but also the huge drain on resources. The cost of housing these migrants that have come over, the economic cost, but also then the burden this will place on our NHS, our education. Our country can't cope.
And this is why multiculturalism doesn't work. The Netherlands are a good example of this, and they were the bastions for multiculturalism. They were for it, and then they saw, as you said, what a drain it was on their society, what a drain it was on their resources, and how all the things that they were taught about how multiculturalism would be so strong for the nation actually proved to weaken the nation. But the danger that our government has, with, irrespective of whether the Rwanda thing works or not, or if it's a good deterrent, is that if politicians don't deal with the immigration crisis in this nation soon, we're going to have something that has happened in the Netherlands, where we move not from far left to a centrist, but we could end up going to a far right, which could cause us even more kinds of problems in a completely different direction. And I think that we've got two existential problems. Existential politically, in the sense that we could end up just knee-jerking straight over to a far right, and for our nation, where we are losing our cultural identity. You know, this is a Western nation, and we're finding that a lot of the immigration people that are coming over, they're ghettoizing into small communities. A lot of it is fundamental Islam, which is, I believe, is a real threat to our nation if we're not careful going forward.
Absolutely, and you can only see that really at the massive demonstrations after
exactly.
October the 7th, which leads me into the biggest mass terrorist attack in Israel's history on October the 7th. I mean, over 1,400 Israelis kind of murdered by Hamas, 3,000 Hamas terrorists committed genocide or pogrom that day, over 260 kidnapped and taken to Gaza, and then over 6,000 injured, and many of those seriously injured as well. And what do you think of the government's reaction to this biggest terrorist attack in Israel's history?
I think Britain did excellently well in the beginning, and I'm very concerned that we have a different foreign secretary who is making noises that are counterproductive in terms of recognizing Israel's right to defend itself. However, what I do think is that so far we are still standing with Israel as a political entity, we with them, and I think that's absolutely vital. But it took 5 days to go from the world saying this is horrific to, oh, did it really happen? And oh, let's fly flags for the people who actually did the work, did the evil. So we're in a very precarious situation globally, and I think, I take your points, Chris. I think, and this isn't to frighten the audience, but one aspect you didn't mention is also the prospect in this nation or in other nations of civil war, because this pro-Hamas movement, it is a pro-Palestinian movement. It isn't entirely politics. It's exciting for young people. It gives them a purpose. And so there are lots of people supporting this, not knowing what they're supporting, but quite vehemently. And although you've been standing with the Jewish people in the Israeli government with some of the marches in Britain, and they're not violent, they're not aggressive, they're not, but the nation, the individuals that are so strident about this are ultimately coming against the vast majority of people who don't want this. And because the aggressor ultimately is Satan, we've got all sorts of things running around in this country and in other countries that can trigger. So America's in a really dire situation politically and in terms of that sort of thing.
I've got 5 minutes left of the programme, so I also want to discuss what's happened in this country after October the 7th, and these have been these massive Palestinian protests that have taken place in London, I think every Saturday since October the 7th, even having protests outside the Israeli embassy before even Israel responded by sending in ground troops into Gaza to destroy Hamas. We saw protesters with showing like stickers with Hamas paragliders on it. We've seen the chants that Palestine will be free from the river to the sea, which is a chant to genocide. We've seen this unprecedented 500% rise of Jew hatred in this country that does actually threaten the very values and the very fabric of our nation. Your thoughts?
Well, I wasn't surprised when I saw all the demonstrations, if I'm honest with you, because I mean, as yourselves know, on programs like this and the work that we've been doing over the years, we've constantly seen Jew hatred in colleges and universities, and so it didn't really surprise me that it was there. But what surprised me was the veracity of it and the sheer volume of it. That took me by surprise. And a lot of this is, I think, fueled by misinformation, propaganda. With certain news stations which have really become Hamas propaganda machines, pushing out a certain narrative, which I think is very dangerous actually. Things like TikTok, these 5-second sound bites giving you a one-sided view, and I think that's gone and added fuel to the fire. And things have moved on so quickly, and that's the problem with today's culture. Something happened Monday, yeah, but now it's Friday. You know, we don't care what happened Monday, but actually you should care what happened on Monday, because, you know, when the pogrom started on October the 7th, that was an attack. That was a war against Israel, and it was disgusting and despicable. In fact, it was worse than what the Nazis done, because you see, with Nazis, when they killed Jewish people, they then had to get drunk to get over it. But these guys, they thought it was hilarious. They laughed, they phoned up their parents, they took pride, they rejoiced in it. Hamas shows a whole nother level of evil that we've not seen before. And everyone seems to be so acclimatized to that level of evil that they think evil is good. So you have people like on Piers Morgan Uncensored, you've got these people coming on who are Muslims that are defending their cause, but also stating that that all the video footage that we saw that Israel revealed is just their propaganda and isn't true. So we must believe all Hamas's official figures on how many people have been killed, which is a terrorist lying organisation, and we choose to ignore what Israel says. And I think we're at a real tipping point in our nation. And I think 2024 is going to be where people really have to look in the mirror hard and actually see how far have we gone as a nation, and can we, and is there still time to turn it back?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
We've got 2 minutes left of the programme. So what are your thoughts politically on 2024? Because it's going to be a big year. We've got a general election coming up in 2024. And of course, we've also got the US presidential election as well taking place in November as well, which will have huge impact not only on British politics, but also what happens around the world.
I would say there's two options. It's an absolute shambles right now. This government, the situation in America yesterday, Trump, Colorado state said, oh, he's not allowed to run as president. And some will agree with that, others will say that's illegal. Okay, so that's an absolute shambles. Joe Biden, we don't know what capacity he has. It appears limited. So, and those are the two front runners, so that's a shambles. Over here, we have a pending election with no real leadership.
Absolutely.
On either side.
I'll have to leave it there. So Sarah and Chris, thank you so much for being my guests on Politics Today. You've done a great job, and Happy New Year to both of you. And to our viewers as well, just want to wish you all a Happy New Year. And but we need to be praying very much for our political leaders in 2024. It's a big year. We have a general election, but we also have a US presidential election as well. And this will determine the outcome for the next 4 or 5 years. So thank you for watching Politics Today, and pray that God's peace be with you. Thank you, and God bless you.